Cool. Yeah. Happy Python Day, folks. Really excited to be here today. We're going to be talking about how to speedrun your Python deployments using AZD. First, I'm going to, talk a little bit about like a problem I think a lot of us have faced in the past and why working in the cloud can be pretty challenging. Then I'll talk a little bit about AZD as a solution to this problem, and then we'll finish up with a live code demo, which I know everyone loves, and how AZD can help you in your end-to-end workflow. So to start, we're going to hop right in. I'm going to ask you to recall a time when you were building an application. You probably went through some form of speccing or ideation phase, or maybe you had like business requirements from someone. And if you can't think of something, maybe let's consider a to-do application or something super basic where you can an app where you can keep track of daily tasks. You probably want the ability to add tasks, add due dates, tick things off when you've completed them, or organize them by categories or into lists. And I think for most folks, this is fairly simple. Because at a basic level, you need three major components. You would need your front end, your back end, and a database to store all the tasks and all the right metadata. So from there, you may need to make the first set of big decisions about your application. And you might have some existing knowledge about libraries and frameworks, have a tech stack that you've used before, or you might need to do some research to identify the best options for your application. But after careful consideration, you might take those components that you outlined in your sort of like ideation phase and choose some libraries and frameworks to move forward with. So maybe that's React for your front end, Python with Fast API for your back end, and maybe MongoDB or Postgres for your database. Or maybe you started building and designing in tandem. I'm not here to mandate your development process. Either way is cool. But then you get your local prototype working, and then comes the fun part: getting the application up and running and hosted somewhere in the cloud. And from there, you probably need to do some more research, and this can quickly spiral into a lot of questions as you research and stumble upon official docs and blogs, tutorials. More questions pop up, like which cloud services should I use with my code? How do I set up my local development environment to be productive when working with the cloud? How do I provision the right infrastructure for my application? How do I know that what I'm doing incorporates security best practices? And some of these questions might not have answers that are super straightforward. And even after doing some research, you might end up with like, it depends on X, Y, or Z being the answer to any one of those questions, which makes things like pretty complicated and also maybe a little bit frustrating at times. But why is it so complicated, right? Why does it have to be so complicated? And I think that if you've ever considered investigating cloud services, you might have been confronted with a solution that looked something like this. And right off the bat, you can kind of see that basic web app, our three-component app, turned into many more things when we added the cloud to the equation. And these resources don't really map one-to-one with those components, which adds complexity. But not only that, there are also new problems added to the mix, like setting up roles and permissions, getting our local development environment set up, configuring a CI/CD pipeline, and more. So obviously, that's like a lot to think about and manage. And what started as a pretty simple web application actually turned out to be a little bit more complicated when we add the cloud to the equation. All in all, answering all of those cloud-specific questions, provisioning infrastructure, deploying code on Azure, it's a lot to think about and manage, especially if you don't have, you're not well-versed in cloud infrastructure, architecture, best practices, all that good stuff. But if you're a new developer, you're already sort of like inundated with learning how to write Python. You might not have the bandwidth to take on learning yet another thing. And if I think back to when I was learning how to write code, I was usually focused on one piece of engineering or one concept at a time. Like I'm trying to write Python, or I'm trying to learn about React. So maybe you don't have the bandwidth to really go and dig into the cloud. And if you're if you're working on business logic or even a professional engineer, you might not have the time to learn about the ins and outs about the cloud. You might want to just focus on writing your application code, and cloud things end up being really peripheral to the primary task that you're trying to accomplish. It's kind of a hurdle on the path from A to B, where A is some problem and B is some solution for your customers. And sometimes you have a dedicated DevOps engineer or a dedicated engineer that thinks through all this engineering systems bits of your product. But sometimes that's not the case. If you're working at a startup or a small business, or you're working on a hobbyist project, or you're a student, this problem of, you don't have that person. So the problem of going from local development environment to the cloud, or provisioning infrastructure and deploying code, is ultimately something that hinders your productivity and your velocity. But thankfully, This is where I think tooling can really help us in that end-to-end journey from, your GitHub repo to local development environment to the cloud. So I want to take a second here to introduce something that my team has been working on for the last couple of years, which is the Azure Developer CLI, or AZD. AZD is an open source tool that provides higher level application developer friendly commands that map to key stages in your developer workflow so that you can focus on writing application code instead of focusing on atomic operations on Azure resources. So we have commands like azd provision, and azd deploy, and azd up, instead of commands that interact with specific resources that require you to pass in a bunch of flags and parameters and arguments and are maybe difficult to remember. We want to keep things simple and easy to remember. That's the name of the game here. But you might be wondering, where's the magic here? Like, how do we get away with keeping things so high level? And so our approach is rather declarative in that the CLI uses extensible, customizable application templates that include everything you need to get up and running on Azure. I like to think of these templates as like cloud blueprints or recipes that include sample application code that's like a proof of concept, reusable infrastructure as code assets that are either written in Bicep or Terraform. These templates go far past Hello World. They include kind of all the bells and whistles that you would need, even to set up your local development environment. So things like editor configurations for VS Code, pipeline definitions, like kind of like skeletons for that, dev container configurations, and more. And so with the CLI, like the idea is that we're not just supporting you in the provisioning and deploying phase of your development process, but also supporting you day to day as you work against cloud resources and use them as part of your application. These templates are also intended to be somewhat programming language idiomatic. So the conventions used in the template are conventions that you should be kind of familiar and comfortable with. We try and keep them as Pythonic as possible when they're Python templates. But really the idea here is that these templates are something that you can build on top of. So you might look at a template and say, that maps to my local application stack. It has React, it has Python, it has a Postgres database. That's the right recipe for me. And then you swap out the sample application code in the template that's included so that you can kind of identify it's the right thing for you, and then customize it and kind of leverage the infrastructure as code assets that are in there that define all your resources on Azure without having to get too deep into the weeds on day one. Okay, last slide before kind of demo. I did want to take just like a brief second to talk about infrastructure as code in case there are folks that aren't super familiar with this space. As I mentioned before, AZD, any AZD compatible project has infrastructure as code files written in either Bicep, which is domain-specific language used for provisioning Azure resources, or Terraform in an infra directory. And this directory and the files inside it are like really integral to how the Azure Developer CLI knows what to provision for you and how to deploy your code on Azure. And if you're unfamiliar, infrastructure as code is really just a way that you can manage and kind of provision your cloud infrastructure and services via code. The files in this directory specify like the services you want to create, their configurations, and how they interact. And using infrastructure as code, we can really ensure that the environment is created the same way each time that we deploy to the cloud. And so infrastructure as code means that you and your team don't have to manage or maintain individual environment settings. You can all work off the same well-documented code that represents your desired environment state, which helps you avoid deployment issues by keeping everything super consistent. With the template ecosystem, you don't have to learn about infrastructure as code on day one, about learning about the cloud or using AZD. But I did want to highlight these files before we get into the demo because they're really important for AZD to like know what resources you're going to use and how to really deploy your code and actually set up your application. But the best part is that you start with these files and then, on day one, and then you can go and dig into the cloud specifics more slowly as your application requirements change. Okay, it's demo time, the moment everyone's been waiting for. Okay, I'm gonna hopefully switch over to VS Code. I think it is showing, so we're good to go. We are looking at a template that is a containerized React web app with Python API and MongoDB on Azure. So if I was writing a JavaScript front end with Python API, this app uses Fast API. You could use Flask, you could use Django. We have flavors for that too. But basically, if I scroll in here, and I hope this is big enough and y'all can tell me if it's not. But if I look through here, we have a brief description about this template. that I pulled from. There's a couple different places you can find templates. You can find them on GitHub using the AZD templates topic. We have an open source template gallery, which has Microsoft authored and community authored templates called Awesome AZD. Or you can actually just run AZD commands, and we have a selection of them in the product itself. I got this from our template gallery, but basically we have a blurb about the template. We have a brief screenshot about what's going to be produced here. In this case, it is a to-do app. I don't have to care about the to-do part. We're going to see why in a second. I have my prereqs. So we have obviously the Azure Developer CLI for our provisioning and deployment. We have Python, Node for our front end. And we're also going to be doing all of this in containers, hosting everything on container apps. So we need Docker. We have a quick start, which we're going to go through in just a second. And then the last thing I want to show in the README is an application architecture diagram. Because I'm so zoomed in, this is going to be I have to scroll to show you it. But basically, this just shows us how all of our resources, all the resources we're going to use for this application and how they're wired up, how they interact. So kind of giving you a bit of context there. Okay, I also have the Azure Developer CLI extension for VS Code installed. If I can scroll and find it in my list of stuff. Oh no, Ubuntu, sorry. Here we are. This provides us with some nice entry points to AZD functionality. It does not install the Azure Developer CLI, but it gives you some nice gestures in VS Code that make it a little bit easier to use AZD if you're not a terminal or a shell person. I obviously have the Azure Developer CLI extension, or the Azure Developer CLI installed already. I type azd-h. We can see all of the commands, a bunch of commands, some of the ones that I mentioned earlier as well, like azd up, azd down, provision, all that good stuff. But let's talk about, before I kind of jump into it, let's talk about what makes an AZD template an AZD template or compatible project. So the first, and what I would argue is maybe the most important file, is an azure.yaml. This is a really basic YAML file. I am not a YAML fan. I think every time I see a YAML manifest or Kubernetes manifest, I'm like, it's kind of a lot of boilerplate. We try and keep this super simple. But basically, the takeaways in here are that I have two services, or you can think about those as your two components that we had in our local app stack. We had our front end and our back end, and we had a database. In this case, we have web, which is our front end, and API, which is our back end. We are pointing AZD to where the source code lives. In this case, we have an SRC directory with API and web subdirectories. You could structure this however you want. We don't mandate any particular file structure. So long as you can pass in a path, you're good to go. We also specify a language. This is JavaScript with Python, both hosted on container apps. So this is really how AZD knows what code is going to go where and how it stitches everything together for you. So I like to think of this as the AZD file. The next most important thing, and the only other real requirement of an AZD compatible project, is an infra directory with a main.bicep or a main.tf if we were writing Terraform. In this case, I have bicep. That is the domain-specific language that Azure has created for infrastructure as code. But in here, the thing that you can really glean from this, if you don't want to go too deep into the weeds, is that I have all of my resources at a top level included in this file. So we've structured this in terms of modules. So there's no magic here. You could totally click into each one of these things, go and see what kind of SKUs, configurations, all of the knobs you could turn on the services. But we try and keep it high level so that if you went in here, it's not immensely overwhelming because there are a lot of configurations you could set. But in here, we can see we've got a resource group, which is our bucket for our resources on Azure for this application. We've got a container apps environment and a registry where we're going to push our container images to. We've got two container apps instances for our front end and our back end. Cosmos DB with MongoDB API for our database. Key Vault for storing our application secrets. We do not want to be inlining our tokens and passwords because that's not a security best practice. Monitoring infrastructure, which includes a dashboard in this case, which I'll show in a second. And then also optionally a feature called Azure API Management, which would mediate requests between your front end and back end. We're not going to enable that for this run, as it does take a little bit to deploy or provision, but you could enable that. And then at the bottom, we've got a million different outputs. These are all things that are going to end up in a .azure directory. I've already run this ahead of time to save us a bit of time. But basically, these things all end up in a .azure directory, which is in here. I've got a .m file, and all of these basically end up in here at the end. And this is how AZD knows, where all of your endpoints are, all that good stuff. This is not checked into source control. It's something that is required for you in your local or wherever you're running AZD though. Okay, let's get into it because I've talked at you for a while. So I'm gonna clear this out. I'm gonna, I have a couple different ways of firing AZD commands. I could obviously just type it in the terminal, but because I have the VS Code extension installed, I could right click on my Azure YAML, go down to the context menu, which has Azure Developer CLI, because the CLI or the AZD extension kind of inserts that into this context menu on the Azure YAML. And then I could go to a command called azd-up. This is what I would argue is the most magical AZD command in that it combines 3 commands into one command so that I can, run it and kind of go get a coffee and wait 5 minutes and then have everything be done for me. It's not really magical, but I like to think that it's a little magical. So I've already run this ahead of time. When you run this the first time, it gives you some prompts. It asks you for an environment name, which is really, I have that in here. Let me find it. Well, the environment name is really this, my Python day, this string. Yeah, here we are. This is not your virtual environment name. I want to really echo this for this audience because I know that environment is sort of an overloaded term. But in this case, environment name is like a string that will be used to differentiate copies of your application on Azure. And so it ends up being part of your resource group name, which is your bucket for all of your resources on Azure. We support multiple environments, and you can imagine why that would be powerful if you think about having dev, test, and prod environments. AZD does handle that. We're not going to show that today, but we could do that. We also are asked for a subscription, so I can authenticate using AZD. I've done that ahead of time. Pick my subscription that I want to use, and then pick a location. In this case, I just picked West US 2, but you could pick whatever you like. So then, once AZD has that information, we kick off each one of those commands, AZD package, AZD provision, and then AZD deploy, which are combined for AZD app. During package, because this is a containerized application that includes Docker files in each of these subdirectories, AZD will go off and create the container images for you. You could also, use these hashes and to test the images locally if you wanted to. We try and keep things, again, very transparent. We strive to be very non-magical, and you can really think about AZD as like a buddy that is like orchestrating a bunch of work on your behalf. And so AZD creates these container images for you using AZD package. I will plug that as of today, literally today, this morning, we now support cloud native build packs. So if you don't want to write a Docker file and you're targeting container apps in your Azure YAML, like we are for this project, AZD can use cloud native build packs to infer your local application stack and then generate the container images for you. If you opt into that experimental or alpha stage feature, no Docker file required, which is pretty cool. All right, we are already blazing through provisioning. So now what we're doing is we're essentially going through that bicep file that we looked at earlier. Let's go back to that top level bicep file. And here, all of these big top level resources I talked about, like the resource group, the key vault, we got log analytics workspace, Cosmos DB, container apps environment. All these things are being created for us without having to go to the portal. And I really love this because they're human readable names, which I love. I also have a unique identifier that I could go and reference in the Azure portal, look at the deployment, get a sense of, what's going on, but I don't have to. For me, staying in my local dev context is really important to me. So I don't want to go jumping around between, browser and editor. If I can stay in my editor, I'm pretty happy. Okay, so this is going to take five-ish, 6-ish minutes. And the reason for that is that we're not just zipping your application up and throwing it on a VM. We are literally creating all of the cloud native infrastructure that you need to run this application, trying to give you kind of a best practice foundation. We're creating resources, setting up roles and permissions, wiring everything up for you so that you're set up for success and you can make big changes later on with very little effort. So really thinking about this in a cloud native way. Okay, we're going to do some demo magic here because I don't want to wait for 5 or 6 minutes because we are getting close to the end of the session. But as this would finish, we'd see the last of our container apps created, and then AZD would go and they take the container images that we created, push them up to a registry, and then use them to create the container or to set up the container instances for our application, for our API and our web, and then print out 2 endpoints for our API and our web services. This completed in 6 minutes and 38 seconds, which I think is pretty cool because I mean, with AZD up, I just like ran this and then walked away for 5 minutes and came back and it was done. So if I go and I click this, I'm gonna see that I have a swagger.yaml or openapi.yaml or whatever you want to call it these days to explore my backend. And then if I wanted to, I have, well, I do want to, this is like arguably the most important part, is that I have a fully fledged application running on Azure infrastructure. I can go and I can add things to my database. I can, actually interact with this, and it's fully set up for me, which is pretty neat. So that's kind of like the main piece of AZD, is that like AZD up. The next thing I want to show really quickly is that we do also support, we have a gesture called AZD monitor. I'm actually going to show a different way to get to AZD functionality by opening the command palette and running Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P, depending on your operating system, typing Azure Developer CLI and then monitor. When I run this, it just runs AZD monitor, and then I'm given some options. I can look at live metrics logs or the overview dashboard. I bet you I'm going to have to authenticate. We'll find out in a second. But basically, the reason that I love this is that it allows me to jump right to where I want to be in the portal without having to like click through a bunch of different screens. This was created for us during the provisioning stage, and all of this dashboard is actually included in your infrastructure as code. But what's really cool about this is I think that it provides you with like a pretty cool, solid foundation to get usage, reliability, responsiveness metrics, and then like a very seamless gesture to get right to where you want to be. Again, I like staying in my local dev context in my editor. So if I can avoid kind of all of that that ceremony of getting to the right place in the portal, I'm usually pretty happy. Okay, last sort of like demo is arguably my most favorite AZD feature, which is AZD pipeline config. I like AZD pipeline config because it really, for me, it's great that we can trigger a manual deployment, a provisioning and deployment. But if we're building like a real application, a real production application, we do not want to be doing that from our editor. We want to be doing that in a pipeline that we've like codified and that we have, a GitHub action written that we can trigger on tag or push to main or master branch. So if I go into my .github directory, we have provided a sample GitHub action. I say sample because really you can customize this, but this will get you your provisioning and deployment in your pipeline. We also support Azure DevOps. GitHub Actions is our default provider, but you can totally use Azure DevOps if that's your flavor of CI/CD provider. But if I go in here, I can see that I have it set up to push on main branch. You could change this if you want. We also are referencing a bunch of like repo variables, repo secrets, instead of doing kind of interactive stuff. So we're like storing that on the repo and then referring to it in the pipeline. We use the official AZD GitHub action to install AZD in the runner. We are going to use federated credentials, which is OpenID Connect or OIDC, which is a security best practice. That's the default credentials source in GitHub Actions. And then, so this block will be skipped. And then we have AZD provision and AZD deploy, which are sub-steps in that AZD up command. The only difference is that we're using -- no prompt and then leveraging those repo secrets and variables instead. So in this case, I guess what I will say is that you might, if you've done this before and you've set up repo variables, you know that it's kind of tedious, especially when you want to deal with creating service principals and all that kind of stuff. So AZD has a command I'm going to show just generically in the terminal called AZD pipeline config. This will scaffold our pipeline for us. So what it'll do is it'll, in a second here, it will go off and start creating a service principal so that GitHub and Azure can talk to one another. And then it'll set up a bunch of repo variables for us so that AZD can reference them in the pipeline run. And then I will go and I'll commit it. If you didn't have a repo already set up, AZD could also push to a new repo or push to an existing repo. And then, again, I like to stay in my editor. I have the GitHub Actions extension installed for VS Code, which means that I can monitor my pipeline run from within my editor without having to go to GitHub. So I can see all the same steps that we talked about here and the progress of each one of those. And now every time I commit code or push directly into my main branch because I'm I don't know, breaking the rules, I could trigger this pipeline in this case. So that's pretty much the end-to-end AZD demo. I'm going to pop back over to my slides and close us out here. But there's one more feature that I want to talk about, which also was announced this morning, but is rolling out later this month. But we've talked about this template-centric workflow where I find a template, I modify a template, and then run an AZD up. As of this month, we're going to start rolling out a feature which we're calling the simplified or easy init flow, which will basically allow you to pass in your code base. So maybe you already have a locally working prototype by running azd init, and then have the CLI infer your local application stack. So maybe that's Python, React, Postgres, and then the CLI will go and generate the configuration, so that Azure YAML and the infrastructure as code to get your application up and running on Azure. And then hopefully you can run azd up with little to no modifications for Azure. And so we're actually going to be leveraging those cloud native build packs that I mentioned before if you don't have a Docker file. And then for our V1 kind of experimental offering, because this is a very new feature, we will be targeting Azure Container Apps. So really, if you want to write your own Docker file for your front end or your back end, totally welcome to do that. But this is powered by cloud native build packs via the Oryx build system. And so you don't have to think about that if you don't want to. If you do see this feature come out, I think we're targeting around the 20th. It is experimental. Please let me know if it worked for you or did not work for you. And if you have any feedback, I would be so elated to talk to you about it. I'm super excited about this feature. I'm sure there are 1 million edge cases for us to go and chase down. So really looking forward to your feedback on that. Okay, let's close out here. To wrap this up, this is kind of what we saw. This is the AZD workflow. So the first question might be, what do I want to build? And this is that ideation phase of the development process that I mentioned earlier. But via the azd template list command or azd init, or going to our templates topic on GitHub or to our template gallery, you can find a template that kind of maps, supports you in finding that right foundational recipe for your application in the cloud. You can use azd init or just git clone or open it in a code space to get it into your local dev context. And then from here, you can modify the template to really make it work for your application specific requirements. Remember, these are designed to be very flexible. Make them your own. You could also make your own code base AZD compatible if you want to write infrastructure as code. We have starter templates included in azd init that give you all of the bicep or Terraform modules to get started. Then it's on to the cloud with azd provision and azd deploy. These commands are used to provision infrastructure and deploy our code on Azure based on those infrastructure as code assets. But better yet, you can use azd up like I showed earlier, which combines azd package, azd provision, and azd deploy into a single step. And then finally, we talked a little bit about best practices using azd monitor and then azd pipeline config to set up our monitoring infrastructure and get to our dashboards, and then also set up our CI/CD pipeline. So that pretty much wraps up this talk. I hope that I convinced you that cloud doesn't have to be so hard when you have the right tools to support your workflow. And I will leave this slide up just to give folks some handy links. I'm sure some of these have been passed in on the stream already. Like Dawn and Haley mentioned, we host community stand-ups once a month following our monthly release. Our next one is on September 20th at, I think, 11 a.m. Pacific time. We would love to see you there. It's a good time to ask the team a bunch of questions and learn about new things that are coming to the CLI. Otherwise, there's some links here for installing the CLI, going to our docs, looking at our GitHub repo, which is fully open source, and then our template gallery. And this is a short link to get directly to all the Python templates. But yeah, thanks so much for listening. Would love to. I'm really excited to see what you all build.
I definitely thought the cloud was scary before this. Now I feel better about it. Now I like the cloud. I mean,
I'll be honest. So I worked on the Python language team at Microsoft before working on AZD, and I used to really be scared of Azure. I think there's a lot to learn there, and so I think we're trying to accelerate your journey, but not make it so magical that you can't understand what's going on. I think that's my personal goal.
No, I love it. This has been so exciting. Every time you do one of these talks, I learned something new. It's the coolest thing ever.
Oh, thanks, Haley.
So we have a bunch of great questions here. Okay. We'll go through a couple while we still have time here. So I did want to pull up this. Doug asked, can already existing applications utilize AZD if they weren't set up with it?
Absolutely, yes. So I think the intention really is that you're not just deciding to start with AZD. The idea, right, is that you can either go find a template to map to your local application stack. So maybe that is React and Python and Postgres or Mongo or something. And then basically pull that template code, initialize your application with that template, and then inherit all those infrastructure as code assets so that you can get up and running on Azure quickly. But also with that new template, that new feature that I mentioned, that simplified init flow, what you could do is also run azd init and then pass in your local, your code in your like current context. And then azd will say, oh, I detected these languages in these paths in the project. I think you will want it. We're going to do container apps for our first offering. So it'll basically say, yeah, we can use container apps for this, and then generate all of the infrastructure as code, all the configurations for you. It also will give you a next steps.md, which will help you kind of like understand what was generated, if there are any like troubleshooting steps that are needed before running azd up, and kind of guide you through what just happened, because lots of stuff happened. But yeah, definitely like this is like the prime use case is like, I have my local prototype, now what?
Mm-hmm. How about the relationship between azd and Copilot?
Yeah, so I mean, azd is not AI infused today. That's you can definitely use Copilot to help you write like application code for your app, and like we also include things like dev container configurations in some of our templates, and so you could definitely like install it as part of your dev container image. But azd itself doesn't have like a direct relationship with Copilot. I do think that they marry nicely together, and I use Copilot, like Copilot and Copilot chat in my workflow with azd, and it is like a power move, I would say.
Cool. One last question here. This is very cool. Definitely agree, JD. Will this work with Azure Functions?
Yeah, we have actually many different templates that use Azure Functions. There's a to-do app flavor one that like of the app that I showed earlier. Instead of being on container apps, we have one that uses static web apps and then Azure Functions for the backend. But there are plenty in our open source template gallery.
Awesome. Speaking of the template gallery, KJ Miller called out Pamela Fox for some of the awesome work that she's done in the azd templates gallery here. And I just wanted to pull this up because I think it's super cool seeing what the community has contributed. And I'll also pull up the banner here.
It's like it's very awesome to see people that are, in the community contributing to the template gallery. I mean, shout out to Pamela, shout out to all the Python CDAs that I work with, all the cloud developer advocates. Y'all are amazing, and working with you is a joy. These templates there's like literally a flavor for everything. You want to do like an AI powered app with OpenAI. You want to create your own chat GPT powered by your own data. We got it. It's in there, and I'm like super excited. I will also say this website is getting like a complete revamp in the next like month and a half. And so it will look like even more glorious once we've had so many contributions that now the filters look a little wild. And so we're going to be restructuring this website to make it even easier to browse. So definitely stay tuned for that.
Yeah, this is super cool. Link is down below for the template gallery here.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much, Savannah. This was awesome. I know I kept you a little bit late and we pulled you on a little bit early because you just have so much great content to show.
I can't stop talking about azd, y'all. But yeah, come hang out in the community call or ping me on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it these days. Happy to chat. Thanks.
Yep. Bye, Sav. Before we move into the next session, I also just wanted to add, we had great sessions at PyCon US this past summer here. And so if you go to the link, I'll add the link into the chat. But we had perfect, it's right down there. We had a bunch of great sessions. And so I know we've been linking the Cloud Skills Challenge. If you just want to learn more about Python and Microsoft, how we work with Python, there's a bunch of great sessions here.